There's a particular kind of magic that live television creates. The illusion of seamless, effortless conversation between polished professionals. Nobody sold that illusion better than Johnny Carson. For 3 decades, he sat behind his desk on The Tonight Show and made everything look easy. What he never let the audience see was just how hard he was sometimes working to keep that illusion intact, especially on the nights when his guests arrived having already had a very different kind of evening than the one Carson had planned. The stories that have emerged from behind that famous blue curtain paint a picture of a television era that feels almost unimaginable today. A time when some of the most celebrated names in American culture, comedians, actors, writers, musicians, would walk onto the most watched talk show in the country in states ranging from pleasantly lucid to barely upright, and the man behind the desk would simply adjust, improvise, and carry on. No scandal, no social media firestorm, just television being made in real time by a host who was arguably the greatest of all time. Understanding why this happened so frequently requires stepping back into the world that produced it. The 1970s were unlike any decade before or since in American entertainment. The counterculture revolution of the 1960s had blown the doors off conventional behavior, and what had once been confined to underground scenes had moved with startling speed into penthouse apartments, film studio backlots, and celebrity green rooms. Cocaine had become practically a professional courtesy in certain entertainment circles. Marijuana was no longer the exclusive territory of jazz musicians and bohemian poets. It was George Carlin's creative fuel and Tommy Chong's entire personality. Alcohol had always been part of show business, and it remained so. The Tonight Show's green room bar was stocked with top-shelf everything, personally approved by Carson himself, and the unwritten rule that guests should limit themselves to 1 drink was about as enforceable as asking the tide not to come in. Carson himself enjoyed a drink, but he was famous for his ironclad self-control on air. That discipline, combined with his extraordinary ability to read people within seconds of meeting them, created a unique dynamic. He became, over the years, the world's most skilled manager of other people's impairment, capable of scanning a guest the moment they walked through the curtain and instantly recalibrating his entire approach based on what he saw. His production team developed an elaborate system of silent signals to communicate across the studio floor without the audience noticing. A hand touching his tie meant the guest wasn't fully sober. Note card straightened twice meant keep the camera work simple and be ready for anything. These weren't improvised gestures. They were finely tuned language developed through years of unpredictable live television. George Carlin was perhaps the least complicated chapter in this story, though certainly one of the most entertaining. By the early 1970s, Carlin had undergone one of the most dramatic public reinventions in comedy history, shedding his earlier clean-cut persona in favor of something rawer, more philosophical, and openly countercultural. His cannabis use wasn't a secret he was keeping. It was practically part of his stage name by that point. Camera operators remembered his glazed expression as something they stopped noticing because it was simply always there. Yet Carlin's saving grace, at least from Carson's perspective, was that the weed didn't actually impair him in any meaningful professional sense. It slowed him down to a frequency where the really interesting thoughts seemed to gather and organize themselves, and what came out was often genuinely brilliant. Carson learned to work with this rather than around it, lobbing open-ended questions like slow pitches and then sitting back while Carlin's mind wandered through fascinating, hilarious territory. The results were some of the most memorable talk show segments of the entire era. Carson happily booked him more than 130 times. He just never let him run the show alone, because there are limits to trust, even for genius. Richard Pryor was a more complicated proposition. With Pryor, you never quite knew which version was going to sit down across from you. On his best nights, he was simply the most alive, funniest, most electrically present person in any room on earth. On other nights, something would shift midway through a segment. His focus would blur, his eyes would change, and he'd drift somewhere that the cameras couldn't follow. Stage managers who worked his Tonight Show appearances described it as watching someone tune in and out of the same channel. Carson would spot the drift and become a conversational traffic cop, redirecting with a quick question, buying time with a joke, creating a smooth cut to commercial that looked entirely intentional to anyone watching at home. What Carson never did, even during Pryor's most erratic appearances, was exploit the situation. He understood that Pryor's genius and his self-destruction were tangled up together in ways that deserved compassion rather than judgment, and he managed those segments accordingly. Pryor reportedly acknowledged this privately years later, expressing genuine gratitude that Carson had chosen to protect rather than expose him. Then there was Truman Capote and the night that changed everything backstage. Capote had been a reliable and entertaining Tonight Show presence for years. Sharp, gossipy, brilliantly observant, always worth a segment. His January 1980 appearance was different before he even reached his chair. The sound technician working that night remembered his speech as nearly incomprehensible, his head dropping forward repeatedly before snapping back with a startled expression, as though he kept surprising himself by being on television. The control room, by multiple accounts, descended into something approaching panic. Carson's on-air expression gave him away to anyone paying close attention. That famous relaxed smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The questions were stripped to their absolute simplest form, and the effort behind the apparent effortlessness became visible in a way it almost never did. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, Carson's composure evaporated backstage. He was furious, not with the impairment itself, but with what it communicated. Capote had essentially told the audience and the show that he couldn't be bothered to show up in a functional state, and Carson found that unforgivable. Capote never appeared on The Tonight Show again. The Green Room bar service became more carefully monitored shortly thereafter. Cheech and Chong occupied a category so unique it barely fits alongside the others. Their entire artistic existence was a celebration of cannabis culture, and Carson had the wisdom, or perhaps the mischievous instinct, to lean into it completely rather than attempt to manage it. He played the bewildered square to their cheerfully stoned comedy duo, asking apparently naive questions about their drug references with an expression of studied innocence that the audience understood perfectly. It was collaborative performance, with everyone in the room fully aware of exactly what was happening and enjoying it enormously. When Tommy Chong launched into a rambling, structurally ambitious story during one appearance that showed no signs of finding its conclusion, Carson simply waited, eyebrow slightly raised toward the camera, and the audience laughed harder at the waiting than they might have at any punchline. He wasn't managing them. He was playing with them. The distinction mattered, and it showed. Peter Fonda brought something to The Tonight Show in 1970 that the production team had not previously encountered in quite that form. The easy shorthand from those who were there is that his pupils were the size of dinner plates, and he appeared to be receiving information from a dimension that the studio cameras couldn't capture. Carson asked about upcoming projects, the most standard of all talk show questions, and Fonda began a response about a film before transitioning, with apparent logic visible only to himself, into a meditation on the nonlinear nature of time and humanity's collective consciousness. Carson tapped his note cards twice on the desk, the emergency signal, and the crew cut to commercial after barely 5 minutes of a scheduled 12-minute interview. When the show returned, Fonda had been replaced by the next guest, and Carson continued without a single word of explanation, as though the preceding 5 minutes had been entirely routine. His assessment afterward was characteristically generous. Everyone has difficult nights. Give him another chance eventually. Fonda did return, years later, for interviews that stayed firmly within the boundaries of linear time. Oliver Reed arrived and reminded everyone that there is a significant difference between impairment that creates interesting television and impairment that creates a security concern. Reed was visibly intoxicated from the moment he sat down, and what began as slurred but technically manageable conversation escalated with uncomfortable speed into something more physically unpredictable. When he rose from his chair unexpectedly and demonstrated a fighting stance, security personnel moved toward the stage, and Carson's body language shifted in ways that people who knew him well recognized immediately. He shut the segment down with firm, decisive efficiency, no meandering toward a graceful exit, just a firm hand on the wheel and a hard turn. Reed was permanently banned, and Carson's message to his team was unambiguous. The show could accommodate a great many things, but not aggression, not hostility, and not the genuine possibility that someone might hurt someone else or humiliate the audience. Sammy Davis Jr. in 1974 was a subtler story, and in some ways the most interesting one. Davis was always high energy. That was simply his natural register as a performer. But the 1974 appearance registered as something beyond his baseline, even to people accustomed to his enthusiasm. He was talking with unusual speed, physically unable to remain still, beginning thoughts and interrupting himself before they resolved, his eyes moving constantly around the studio. Industry insiders backstage drew conclusions that Davis himself never confirmed publicly. What made his case different from the others was that his professionalism never slipped even slightly. He remained charming, entertaining, and in complete command of his performance throughout, just with the volume turned considerably higher than usual. Carson matched his energy, guided gently when needed, and when they cut to commercial, reportedly wiped his brow and told the crew he'd just contracted secondhand exhaustion. When asked about that appearance in his later years, Davis reportedly smiled and suggested that some things about the 1970s were best appreciated without too much retrospective examination. What connects all 7 of these stories is the figure at the center of each one, a man who had developed, over 30 years of live television, a philosophy about his guests that was fundamentally pragmatic and quietly humane. Carson didn't particularly care what a guest had consumed before sitting down across from him. What he cared about was whether that person could still create something worth watching, and whether they were treating the audience with the basic respect of genuine effort. By that measure, Carlin was always welcome. Pryor was worth protecting even on his most difficult nights. Capote had crossed a line that had nothing to do with substances and everything to do with showing up. Oliver Reed had crossed a different line entirely. The world those stories come from feels distant in ways that go beyond the obvious. There was no social media to replay and dissect a shaky interview indefinitely. There was no cancel culture waiting in the wings for a celebrity who seemed less than sharp on a Tuesday night in 1977. Carson controlled his domain with absolute authority, and his instinct was always to smooth things over rather than amplify them. If he decided something was a minor incident, it became a minor incident, absorbed into the vast, good-natured flow of 3 decades of nightly television.